thank everyone for coming tonight, and I'll introduce our speaker tonight, Roger Ehrenberg. Roger is a U of M alum, so we're welcoming him back in that regard. Go Blue. And Roger started out his career in the financial services industry on Wall Street, actually, and moved his way to angel investing, and then to a VC, not exactly a conventional path to become a VC. And Roger's firm focuses on big data sets, analytics, and he'll tell you more about that. So without further ado, Roger.
Thank you, Russ. You'll have to understand, I am just beyond thrilled to be here to come back to my school in this capacity and to want to kind of do business with people in the community. It's unbelievably exciting, so thank you very much for letting me bend your ear for a little bit here. So, because the purpose of the talk is to tell you a little bit about how we view data at IA Ventures. As Wes said, the venture firm that I founded a few years ago is really founded around this notion that the tools and technologies for managing data have changed dramatically in the very recent past, and that it is a truly generational opportunity. And not just for the tools and technologies themselves, but for the really interesting data assets that are being created in the process. And so what I'm going to do is give you kind of our lens of what big data is and how we view the monetization of that data as part of our investment strategy. So why now? Big data has become this incredibly hackneyed term, and quite frankly, it annoys me. And I almost never use the term big data anymore. I read a blog called Information Arbitrage, and I deliberately said, like, big data is the new .com. It's ridiculous. So hopefully what we're going to do today is I'm going to get a little more granular to move beyond the generalizations into more concretely where we see the value in data. So one of the reasons why it's so buzzy right now is it's everything. Every entity has data that can potentially be interesting, whether you're talking about ad tech, government, Wall Street, e-commerce, or in pharma. There's really not an area that's not now devoting a lot of energy to figuring out how to better manage and extract value from their data. There's no doubt that the past 50 years have seen just dramatic changes in infrastructure that have made the cost of enabling technologies just plummet. Whether you're talking about hardware, software, processing, it doesn't matter. They've all plummeted, which is why it's so wonderful for the startup community. But then the question is, how is value going to be created? I look at Amazon and kind of the recommendation engine as being an amazing example of taking these big data tools and technologies and actually bringing them to life in a user experience that, at least for me, is super positive. Like, I love that they're able to recommend for me stuff that I find really interesting. It kind of cuts through, the massive opportunities. And so this is kind of, the use of massive amounts of data, not just my data, the data of others, overlaid with predictive analytics to give me a really wonderful user experience. So what is it? Again, I said I hate the term big data. I will try and not use it again in this presentation. So the first thing is to think of it in terms of size. Again, there's a lot of dimensionality to data, but I think the first thing people generally think of relates to size. So small data that can be managed in memory, we generally think of applications like Excel and R. Kind of medium data, where you're talking about storage on disk in a single machine, generally think of relational databases, kind of the monolithic DBs that we principally used until large data and distributed storage with things like Hadoop and breaking up problems across many, many, many machines and then pulling them all together. I think the interesting thing to note, though, is that there have been some people that have written about how making big data powerful is really small data. And there's something to that in the sense that even like very basic computations that some of these small data technologies do incredibly well, like math, much harder to do in distributed architectures when you're sending out the problem and then needing to bring it all back. That is not a trivial task. So it's not as simple as saying that small is bad and large is good. Large is good for some stuff, and small is better for other things as well. So that's just something to keep in the back of your head. So one character of data is data that's unstructured. So here we're talking about commonly text, images, and video. Processing unstructured data is incredibly difficult. It is both computationally intensive and it takes up a ton of space. So this is an area where truly these breakthroughs in distributed storage and processing have made just gargantuan advantages in our ability to manage unstructured data. Then you've also got this vector of real time. The good news is that, basically everyone's learned a lot from Wall Street because stream processing has been on Wall Street for decades. And it's funny to think when the kind of big data revolution became popularized, as somebody who's a longtime Wall Street denizen, I kind of chuckled because we've been doing this stuff for a long time. I mean, when I started, in the mid-'80s in derivatives and then quantitative trading, we were on the bleeding edge of this stuff back then. Now, granted, it's come a long way, but the principles and the foundations were laid a long time ago. The good news is we can process and extract signal from data much more rapidly today than we could in the past. The bad news, though, is that information decay has skyrocketed. So the amount of time that a given piece of information is relevant has been compressed to such an extent that it's basically an arms race. So when we put this kind of dimensionality of data together, what we really kind of come to is this notion of complex data. It's not that it's necessarily big, it's that it's got a lot of dimensionality. There are a lot of features and facets to the data which make it really challenging to get the most out of it and to figure out the best way to store it and process it. Because the thing is, there are tons of dependencies, right? The way you analyze data is strongly impacted by the way you store data. So when we think of the kinds of companies that we invest in, it's really about unlocking intelligence from complex data. And again, the most important part of this discussion is going to be when I actually start throwing some companies up here and talking about their attributes. But this is just to kind of provide this framework for the way that we think about companies and data. So here you can think of kind of the y-axis as being the inputs and the x-axis as being the outputs. So if you think about companies that are going to show up in the bottom left, it's companies where kind of the data that goes in is pretty much the data that comes out. There's not a ton of transformation that goes on. And the companies, as you move to the right, the product itself, what's done to the data, is more transformational. So at the end of this, I've got a theory for where things are going on this chart. There can be huge amounts of debate as to where the companies I'm going to throw up here should go. This is just my swag at what I think will be an interesting conversation starter. So here, Twitter, LinkedIn, and NYSE. So in the case of Twitter, I mean, everybody in this room knows Twitter. People put in tweets and out come tweets. Right? There's not a ton of added value on top of the data that people are contributing to the Twitter ecosystem. Now, it's super powerful as a transmission mechanism, but in terms of them doing tons of stuff to the data and having that be a core part of the consumption experience, it's really not. And LinkedIn, in terms of people's profiles, more or less that's what it is. Now, granted, you can sort and filter and do all kinds of stuff like that. You might want to be friends with this person because your social graph looks like this, but it's pretty much what comes in is what goes out. So here's where we get into companies that are actually aggregating. So as you move up the y-axis, companies are pulling together not their own data, but the data of others. So in the case of GNIP and Data-Centric, so those are the two companies that have the only two Twitter redistribution relationships on the Twitter firehose. In the case of GNIP, it is literally, here's the firehose, we give you different ways to consume it. In the case of Data-Centric, they're doing a bit more to enrich the value of the data in terms of first pulling in a broader array of data, but also they're really moving more towards business intelligence and overlaying things like reputation scores from Cloud and Peer Index, using Lexalytics for semantic analysis of the unstructured data that it's harvesting. But still, fundamentally, it's relatively raw data, but in their case, being higher on the y-axis, it's data from many, many, many sources. And then Thomson Reuters, same kind of thing, right? So in the case of NYSE, people are trading on the NYSE, and that's the data that they're serving up. In the case of Thomson Reuters, you're not trading on a Thomson Reuters. Thomson Reuters is aggregating information from many exchanges and displaying it for you in their UX. So again, as we're moving right, there is kind of greater productization, greater shaping of the data that's coming through the system. So actually, Place IQ, like Data-Centric, is an AI Ventures company. So what they're doing is they are generating hyperlocal intelligence. So they're pulling in information from both licensed and open sources, breaking the world into 100 by 100 square meter tiles, and being able to tell you a tremendous amount about what's going on in a given tile at a given time, and the attributes of the people within that tile, varied by time of day, the businesses around it, the weather, any seasonality, holidays. It's a very rich data set, but much of that data set isn't homegrown. It's data that they pulled in from others. In the case of Bitly, the URL shortener, they've actually started to build some pretty interesting analytics products on top of their core URL shortener. But again, that's data that they are wrapping the links of others. They themselves aren't creating the links. And this I think is pretty interesting. I mentioned Amazon earlier. So Amazon isn't really pulling in data from lots of other places. It's pretty much the data that's being generated across the Amazon platform as a result of all of us clicking around and buying stuff. But in terms of the experience on Amazon, it is a very finished, robust experience. And same thing with Zynga. What happens on Zynga relates to the Zynga data, but again, it's this very rich, fully featured gaming experience that you get when you're playing on Facebook. I think these last couple that we're going to throw up, it starts to get really interesting. So, very different companies, but they all use data, not just their own data, but the data of others in very interesting ways. So in the case of Renaissance Technologies, what is their output? Their output are amazing trading returns. The input is licensed data from lots and lots of sources. I mean, Rentech spends tens of millions of dollars a year on data from myriad sources. Part of their secret sauce is they have an unbelievable back end to cleanse, normalize, and index the data that they're pulling in from these disparate sources, so they have an absolutely pristine archive that they can then use to calibrate their models. In the case of Walmart, I don't know how many of you saw that story on Target about the ability to predict when a woman might be pregnant and sending offers in advance of lots of people even knowing she's pregnant. That's the kind of stuff that Walmart does too. I mean, Walmart, like Target, is a big data company, and they've got a bunch of their own data, but they're also pulling in data like weather data and using that as a vehicle for logistics planning and inventory management. So if they see a huge storm sweeping across the US, they are going to ship salt and shovels and flashlights to those stores that are in the way of the storm. And they're able to make those adjustments literally in real time. So this is my theory. My theory is that eventually everything is moving to the right. That just being a commodity provider of data in whatever form is not going to be enough. That adding value on top of that data is going to become increasingly important. And we're really already seeing even the companies on this list migrating in that direction. That kind of dumb pipes ain't gonna cut. So part of what we think about is, how do you create defensibility? That, being really smart and having really good algorithms is part of it. But what is going to create long-term sustainable advantage relative to the competition? As investors, that's what we think about every single day. So certainly there are these aspects of creating technical differentiation, and I would say probably half to two-thirds of the businesses that we see at IA Ventures are seeking to prove to us that they are better mousetraps. The issue, though, and I can tell you this from real-world experience, this is not sustainable. Better algorithms is not a strategy that's sustainable long-term. It's just not. There are too many smart people working on the same kinds of problems such that if that's all you got, you're not going to be building a very big business. So the issue is creating these intrinsic advantages, moving beyond algorithms. So you've got these great algorithms. You've got data pumping through the algorithms, and the algorithms are telling you some really interesting stuff. Then what? Well, we've got a couple of different paradigms that we think of about how to create competitive advantage that we've actually put into practice in our own investment selection. So this notion of kind of data network effects, about creating contributory databases. And here are three interesting examples. The two on the right are IA Ventures portfolio companies. The one on the left is a $4 billion publicly traded company. But I don't know if you guys know the market, but basically they were the firm that popularized the credit derivatives indices. It started out as an industry consortium. The firms contributed pricing data that then was given back in terms of aggregates and indexes that became the foundation for a multi-billion-dollar licensing business, because literally every credit derivative product that's based upon an index is licensing the market index. Very similar to the business that S&P or MSCI built, but theirs has obviously experienced explosive growth with the rise of securitized products and credit derivatives. In the case of, let me skip to Billguard for a minute. Billguard is a platform for doing crowdsourced credit card fraud detection. So their theory was, if we give consumers a really beautiful user experience where all they need to do is put in their credit card credentials, it goes to the Yodlee API and it sucks in all their transaction level information. And then we're going to look at those transactions relative to the sea of transactions we have from the other Billguard users. And we're going to use machine learning to look for patterns of fraud and unwanted charges. And this is not within a single bank or a single type of credit card. It is a horizontal platform that's looking across all kinds of transactions. And I don't know if you know this, but literally there are thousands of bots generating fictitious transactions every single day. And as good as the bank's spam blockers are and anti-fraud algorithms are, they're losing the battle. So what Billguard posited is, we're going to collect all this data, we're going to figure out what a good transaction looks like, and when it shows up on the user's statement, it's going to have a little check mark, and where there are questions, there'll be a little question mark if it's a transaction where they don't know for a fact it's a good transaction. And then the human goes in and either says, oh no, this is a good transaction, or no, this doesn't look right, and then tells Bilgard to go investigate. So the intersection of machine learning and human curation has created a platform that has saved literally hundreds of thousands of people money. And it does so because they've basically created this huge funnel for this contributory database of people scoring their own transactions. They're creating a data set. The banks don't have it. The credit card companies don't have it because they have this holistic horizontal data set. You think a bank that doesn't want to resolve these problems with a $100 call phone center employee might want to use something like this and pay, a couple bucks per user per month? They do. And then finally, a company like MetaMarkets, which had this notion of having publishers contribute their monetization data and using that as the vehicle for seeing a demand curve that instead of it being a stepwise function, basically premium and remnant, they start to see a smooth function, and all that area under the curve that's currently going to the ad exchanges can actually go to the publisher where it belongs. So we think that these kinds of businesses are really, really interesting because they're creating these defensible data assets that, yes, there are elements of high technology in these, but that's not really the point. The point is less the algorithms, and it's more creating a platform that has natural benefits to those who contribute, and as people contribute, the product gets better and better and better. Then we've got this other paradigm called user economies of scale, where you can think of Google is a great example, where day one, it's not like Google had an interesting data asset. They had some good algorithms, but there were plenty of companies doing search at the time Google came. But they came up with a paradigm that became self-reinforcing. And once it gathered a head of steam, it just kept on going. And they've got a data asset that is truly unparalleled. I actually was just speaking to the Wolverine Venture Fund and had mentioned this company CourseKit, which is a company that is initially started out as a reaction to Blackboard. And the lousy user experience that Blackboard delivers both to the professors and to the students, it was 3 19-year-olds at University of Pennsylvania that dropped out of school after building a product, building a platform that's basically an integration of kind of Facebook and Tumblr for knowledge management, for lifelong learning. And again, for them, it's not about technology. It's about creating an experience that makes people want to interact with it, professors and students alike, to share, where then the experience becomes ever richer, because in the case of CourseKit, it's not just collaboration within a single class, within a single school. They've broken it down by theme. So if you're taking philosophy at the University of Michigan as an undergrad, you can collaborate with students taking philosophy at Stanford, Princeton, and other schools that are on the CourseKit platform. Taking philosophy, maybe reading different materials, but being able to share quotes, excerpts, writings, photos, whatever it is, depending on the course. So that's something that creates very, very strong lock-in and creates an asset that even if you were to give the platform away, and today they are, that you've got unbelievable intent data, amazing social graph data that you could use to either target advertising, lead generation, or even extended learning after somebody gets out of undergraduate school. And the last one I'll talk about here is a company called Simple. It used to be called Bank Simple, where they are attempting to disrupt retail banking. And they started with optimizing user experience on the smartphone and said, why does everybody hate their retail bank? No, one is hidden fees and that I don't trust them. And another is a lack of data portability and data transparency. So they started with that notion and designing a really wonderful user experience and then worked backwards. They're not a bank, but they have a series of relationships, very, very complex infrastructure, to to deliver a seamless banking experience to end users. And again, as people buy stuff and execute transactions, and there's also a social graph element within it as well. You can send money, you can share and collaborate. That they're creating a really unique data asset that we think is going to be very, very exciting at scale. So it's really about activating data. You know, one of my limited partners is Thomson Reuters. They were an investor in my first fund, and you know they really had the vision that they've got this abundance of trapped data, this massive series of trapped assets across this firm that has been pieced together through dozens of acquisitions over the last 25 years. And they're really focused on how do we break down these barriers among these silos and really leverage this both for the benefit of our customers and for the benefit of our shareholders. So this is something that's not just a phenomenon happening in startup land. You know, large companies are thinking about this every single day, and that's why I think we've seen a lot more of media companies and financial services companies trying to find ways to monetize their archival data, which for people like Renaissance Technologies has massive value, and they've created great new businesses around this archival data set. As always, people are key. I can't tell you how many people come to me and my partners and say, we're a big data company. You know, our business generates data. Every business generates data. That's really not what this is about. You know, when we are looking at backing great founders, it's where they have data in their DNA. And it doesn't mean that they're data scientists. It means that they understand that their business is going to generate something valuable, and they want to think proactively and intelligently about how to architect it such that they can monetize this asset as it builds and grows over time and can serve as a source of defensible competitive advantage. And not everybody thinks like that. And again, not every business has that aspect to it, but for those that do, we are really looking for founders that have that essence in their core. Yeah, as I said, you can't make it up. You know, we can tell very, very quickly if somebody really gets it or doesn't get it. And again, it's not just saying that your business generates data is a necessary but insufficient criterion for really laying the foundation for a business that can create defenses well beyond the algorithms. So this is interesting. So we have a scientist in residence at IA Ventures, Andrew Conway, who's a very, very well-known data hacker and data visualization expert. He spent 6 years working in the three-letter agencies doing in network theory. And he came up with this framework for how to think about characteristics of data scientists. So there are kind of these three broad areas: kind of data hacking, being able to rip out code; kind of math and stats, kind of having the academic rigor to really analyze big data; and then domain expertise. So do you have unique industry knowledge that you can bring to bear on solving a particular problem? So this is kind of how he characterized it, and it really resonated with me. Where, right now data scientists are probably the most sought after positions in startups that generate a lot of data right now. Not in that they wouldn't even think of, but in it could be Guild Crew, right? So retail. But again, they're a data company. It could be our portfolio company, Builder. They've got a passive, incredible data scientists. LinkedIn, Pete Skamara, chief scientist there, is a good friend of mine. Let me tell you, they are on the cutting edge of a whole bunch of stuff in the big data realm, and they're just very slowly releasing stuff out to the public. But they are definitely migrating to the right on that chart that I put up earlier. So I think it's just really interesting at how data scientists are unicorns. they combine these three very critical areas of knowledge and bring it all to bear when looking at maximizing value across a large data set. To have the domain knowledge, to have the strong academic foundations, and then to be able to hack. These are hard things in the vacuum, much less combine them all together, but these people do exist. And something that we spend a lot of time thinking about, and actually I spend a lot of my own money pursuing, is how do we make more of these people? Because these people, these skill sets, are foundations for the future. So for us, this is the punchline. This is the holy grail. Creating these intrinsic barriers from data with brilliant data-centric people. None of this stuff is easy. They do exist. But part of my mission is to make sure that more of these kinds of people exist and that I can back businesses that have these characteristics. So that's basically it. I tried to be quick so we could have a bunch of time for Q&A. I hope that provided a useful foundation. So, questions? That's great. Yes.
Yeah. So, like you said, pretty much every business these days generates data, and a common problem that I see businesses running into are ways to share data, particularly across different like cloud services and that sort of thing. I understand it's a bit outside of the area of big data. Do you have any ideas or insight on how to make it easier for all of these cloud services that businesses are subscribing to share their data and get better insight?
I mean, that's certainly an area that we've seen lots and lots and lots of plans around. I mean, whether it's social data and things like Yammer, to companies migrating towards things like Dropbox and shared drives so they can make document collaboration easier, to much more tailored solutions by vertical. I mean, I've seen a ton of stuff in the legal trade where there's kind of a lot of domain specificity, but at the same time, there's a lot of necessary sharing across kind of making the membranes permeable. There's no holy grail. I mean, all businesses are different, and I personally haven't seen anything that kind of holistically addresses the issue that you're talking about. But I agree, it's a huge problem. Was there additional texture that something more specific that you were seeking?
I was hoping for a holy grail.
Yeah. How about this? You find it, tell me about it, I'll find it. Yes.
How do you see data privacy, the creep factor, and as you move to the right, all of those when it comes to laws as well as people's own view, it gets that whole area that I can see that as being kind of a ripped through this, that you start to get too much using your target pregnancy, lots of those things, pizza delivery, it starts to get into this area that
Creepy?
how do you balance that fourth dimension and how does it show up?
Sure. So, we talked about this a little bit earlier. I personally think, in a general way, that privacy is dead. Like, I don't believe that we're going to see crushing legislation that's going to ban, cookies and the kind of tracking that enable Target to come up with this relationship where if you buy, the certain kind of lotion and the cotton balls that a woman's pregnant, that's smart data mining. I think companies themselves need to figure out at what point do they cross into the creep factor, but as a society, I think that we've effectively made a pact, which is we value security. And I don't mean personal privacy, I mean physical security more than we value privacy. And that if you think of a world with no cookies, no GPS tracking, you're talking about a world where bad guys win. They can run amok. I don't think we're willing to accept that. So then you get this continuum of, well, how much openness am I willing to accept? Well, now think about your own personal experience. If you were to go surf the web and there were no cookies, forget about GPS. And every time you came to a web page, it was as if it was your first time. It knew nothing about you except for the story that you were looking at or the picture that you were looking at. And it served you ads with only that as being its data. Your user experience would suck. It would be Internet Circa 1995. Now, I don't know how many people in this room want that. There's nobody I know that wants that. So, personally, I feel like I made a trade. My data's out there. I acknowledge it's out there. I want a great experience on the net and on my mobile device. And that's a trade I'm willing to make. I think there may be different, there's a whole range of opinions on things like opt-in versus opt-out. Now, I can buy that. And I think that may be a place that we go. But in terms of kind of uber legislation, I think that the risk of innovation is so severe that that's not going to happen. I think it's going to be companies like Target figuring out, is it simply too invasive to send coupons to potentially pregnant women with a high degree of accuracy and just saying, you know what, let's forego that or do it later so it's not as shocking. So obviously it's a crappy answer, it's very gray, but that's where my head's at. Yes.
So what if the dichotomy isn't the difference between having no state management on the internet and I mean, it seems to me that you know, of course, no, we do need to have some sort of way to manage state on the internet, but that doesn't necessarily mean that having that means that the person who is allowed to use cookies for state management is also allowed to use the data to track or your presence on the web or your presence in the world. I mean, that's the kind of legislation that could be put in place to say, and back in the day, back when cookies first came out, there was sort of an understanding that we are only using this so that you can log in time and again. We're only going to track a certain amount of information. Now there is an arms race going on, and we've sort of become used to these services. So I can see how it may seem to be inevitable, but you know, isn't it sort of a false dichotomy to say that, you know, either you let Google have all of your information and send you coupons when you're pregnant when they are able to read your email and see that you're pregnant, or else you have to log in every time and we have a stateless internet.
So I guess I would say that I'm not so sure that people, I can't speak for people. To me, it seems a little bit weird that there would be this big brother that sees everything, and yet my user experience on the internet is worse. That to me seems odd, that the government can know everything about my web surfing habits, where I'm located. In fact, turning off my GPS on my phone is the basis for basically saying, I don't want you to know where I am and therefore admissible as evidence, versus I want to have a rich web experience. You can opt out. You can do things to prevent being tracked. Absolutely. And I actually said this earlier at the World Venture Fund that I think maybe more should be invested in education to make it easier for people to do that if they want to do that. I'm not so sure, again, speaking generally, I can only speak for myself, I'm not sure people do want to do that. I mean, you look at Facebook, every time Facebook gets pushback, they back off a little bit, they take a step back, and then they take 2 steps forward. Step back, 2 steps forward. And I haven't heard a lot of bitching about that. It just, people make the trade. So, maybe it's a false dichotomy. That's a fair characterization. I don't know. I've laid out how I think about it, but it's tough. It's a really hard problem. all I know personally, I wouldn't want the government tracking me down to know I'm standing right here, right this second, and at the same time, not necessarily get the kind of experience that I want when I am online or on my mobile. That's just me. Yes?
Going back to your presentation, two questions. One is, do you have a cut on what you think the market size growth rate is? And number two, I absolutely agree with your point about intrinsic barriers. But at this point in time, do you see that there's a constraint relative to basic quantity of skills on the kind of the data processing platform and the analytics layer before we kind of get to the real information value?
So, as for growth rate, no idea. We think about it in a much more segmented way. We're looking at specific markets and then looking at growth rates within those markets as opposed to kind of big data writ large. All I know is it's growing really, really fast. As it relates to the skills, there's a huge dearth of skills. I mean, myself and a bunch of my friends are almost on a holy mission to bring kind of applied learning to this sphere. I can't tell you how much time I've spent with PhD students who are absolutely brilliant, but they can't hack. And if you give them a large data set, they can't rapidly find the knowledge, the insight within it, when they absolutely have the ability. They just don't have the skills. So it's actually probably on the hacking side that people are falling short, and that PhD programs are not really equipping their math and stats grads in particular with those skills. Using MATLAB is not a substitute. R, Python, and other scripting languages that are much more amenable to those kinds of quantitative data sets, that would be useful. So, we're big sponsors of Hack New York, which is all about sponsoring hackathons and working with the doctoral programs of Columbia and NYU to do exactly that. So I agree with you. I think we're very, very early in the game, but that there is acknowledgement that there's a huge need. Yes.
You mentioned about quant or renaissance and quant funds.
Yeah.
And so last year was rather a crappy year for these funds, and Goldman Sachs and others closed down.
Yeah.
And so I'm part of the Chicago Quant Alliance, and I go to these meetings, and some people talk about how there's a shift. For some funds, there's a shift away from quant stuff to more soft stuff.
Yeah.
And so do you have any take on the future of quant stuff with relation to funds? That is it going more into quant behavioral stuff, or is it shifting away? Do you have any idea on that, of the future of that stuff?
Sure. I mean, I'll give you my anecdotal view. I mean, as I gather it's extremely cyclical, right? When quant strategies are out of favor, bottoms up, fundamental long, short tend to be in favor, and the pendulum swings back and forth. I think one of the biggest issues that quant funds are dealing with now is just the change in market structure, and it's harder to be a pure market maker, a pure stat arb than it was even 3 years ago. So that game is kind of played out. So that's why. But then you look at Rentec, they're still ripping. But if you ask Renaissance, they're not high frequency. They're not trading all the time. So it's not a market making activity. It really is, in their case, constantly re-engineering their algorithms. They're one of the rare cases where the algorithms are their competitive advantage, in addition to their data infrastructure. So I've seen a ton of stuff moving in the behavioral area using things like social media. Personally, I haven't seen anything be successful. There are a bunch of small funds in that sphere that have pretty much been done crappy. The quants that I know that are doing well are more eclectic and have longer time scales. So they're not the market maker type like the 2 Sigmas, the Rentecs, AQR. They're all doing really well. So I think, those are the funds that have no portfolio managers. They're all data scientists, and the quality of their training set is just so much better than everybody else's. So I don't know if that answers the question, but yes.
Do you think not having a PhD is a glass ceiling of sorts for a data scientist?
Not at all. Yeah, I mean, I know some super smart data scientists that don't have PhDs. I think over time we'll see more and more that don't have them. It's interesting that I would say most hackers aren't PhDs. So it kind of depends on where you start. So I think the great hackers I know are kind of narrow on domain expertise. So having them work in a business for a while and really get to understand it makes them exponentially more effective. I think that's one way to grow a data scientist. And then to take some more math and stats people, and that's where I'm spending a ton of time, and having them learn to be better coders. That's another area that I think. So I think it's going to be less PhDs necessarily in the future. Although what I am seeing at Columbia, they're starting this, are creating data science tracks that start at the master's level, so that you have enough of the academic foundations such that when you couple it with a little work experience and coding skills, well, there you are. So I think it's going to move younger and younger and younger.
So maybe I just want to speak real quickly to Alan's point as well, because I think it's an interesting question, right? The question of is there a false dichotomy between sort of big data and security, privacy and so forth. I think like 10 years ago, folks had tried to do things that were a little bit more less centralized, and that seems to be the big shift these days, where a lot of the trends that Roger kind of points out of dropping prices of storage and increasing network capacity means that it's so much easier to centralize things for analysis than it ever was before. But I think one thing I wanted to ask you, Roger, was whether you thought this might be possible, or if you're looking at these kinds of opportunities. Again, that's happening because I think of the rise of cloud computing. Again, these sort of kind of economy of scale that we're seeing. But again, 10 years ago, we saw folks like Patty Mize at MIT, right, and Swarm Intelligence, and all that kind of stuff, build these agent-based systems, right? I don't know if you guys remember, but before there's Amazon, there's Firefly. Right? Firefly was an agent-based system that was all, again, similar kind of recommendation systems, all this old RecSys stuff that used to actually be networked, not actually sort of all within this one giant sort of citadel of data. And as we get these phones in our pockets that are actually more powerful, right, than the laptops that we used to have, and they're all networked, right? They're all networked much better than any of the computers were before, and they all have the possibility to do things like mesh networking and so forth. I kind of wonder, right, whether there is the possibility that we start to see more of that kind of stuff that provides that agency and control over personal data in a way that isn't as threatening, but provides as much, again, sort of much richness of sort of insight and interaction as anything we see today. Are you looking at things like that, or seeing any trend towards sort of a distributed sort of technology of things like that?
So the stuff that I've seen has been in the realm of kind of like personal data lockers, where you start to gain control over your own data, and you can effectively sell your own data. So you become your own market for your data. Mm-hmm. So there's Personal and Singly, and there's like 3 or 4 of these companies that have emerged, where you can kind of siphon in your data and create the structured repository and then offer it out for sale. That's mainly the way that I've seen people trying to attack this problem. I'm not convinced it's going to work, but that is kind of a vector of innovation I have seen in trying to deal with this.
The follow-up question to that then is where is the room for startups to innovate in this? Because we sort of look at the trends, right? Like, I'm in security, right? And one of the biggest companies that we've sort of seen that is a sort of concern in that way of privacy and everything else in aggregation is Axiom, right? Axiom's been around since like the 60s, right? And even before that, of course, there's TRW, TransUnion, Equifax, all the credit bureaus, right, which were not selling data but selling access to their data set. And even locally, we've seen companies like All Music Guide, MedStat, which went to, of course, sold to Thomson Reuters, JSTOR, all these folks who have had historical databases, long-term databases of stuff that they're now trying to tease out and build, like JSTOR is hiring data scientists left and right here. Folks are trying to figure out what they do with all this, and that data they already have is a huge advantage. Where's the room for, where are the sort of emerging opportunities that you see for startups in this space when there are some of the historical pools of this stuff?
So I've seen a huge wave of startups in the realm of using social data as a proxy for that legacy data, and actually in certain cases, demonstrating that it's more accurate and effective than kind of the legacy data.
Yeah.
So using your social graph, using the things you do on the internet as a vehicle for developing a credit score, for instance. I mean, I can't tell you how many companies I've seen that are trying to develop new credit scores, right? For whether it's for scores for insurers. So auto insurance is a huge area of innovation. Both the big companies, Progressive is doing some really, really cutting edge stuff, from using devices so you can kind of dynamically price auto insurance by the way you actually drive, not just based upon your static record. Like, are you lucky or are you good?
Right.
So that's one wave. And then this issue that's kind of been spurred on by social lending, the Prospers of the world and people like that. But then, as I said, I probably have seen 20 startups in this area in the past 3 months that are using social graph data as a vehicle to develop a better fingerprint of your credit worthiness, etc. So that's where I've seen a lot of innovation. Yes.
Are data scientists the ones coming up with the big ideas for the data-driven products? What part do they play in those big ideas?
So they are generally not the ones, in my experience, that come up with the ideas. They're the ones that are brought in to help validate.
So where do the ideas come from?
Smart founders who are super curious and have a theory, and they will then, a lot of them are hackers themselves, and will code some stuff up, run some tests, and then try and go to the next level and build leverage their networks to find a great data scientist to work on a larger data set to help really validate their hypothesis, in which case they then develop a prototype and then either bootstrap it or raise money. Yeah.
Isn't there some danger, as we saw with the credit, the real estate bubble, with some of these intelligent algorithms going completely wrong and even breaking the economy for years and years? Are you concerned about these social graphs being used to determine your creditworthiness? How do we know whether they're correct or not? I mean, these are just kind of guesses in a lot of cases, but they could be used detrimentally.
So I think they're two separate issues. I don't think that the models were wrong that led to the real estate crisis. I think that's more an issue of Congress and the GSEs and bad behavior more than models themselves. That's a much longer discussion. But in terms of using social graph data as a vehicle to do things like credit scoring and whether or not they are accurate, I agree. I mean, that's why I think you need to analyze the data, start very, very small, build up actual experience, hopefully across a couple of cycles before you then scale up. So is it possible that that models could be wrong? Yes, of course it could be possible, but I think particularly with those kinds of products, and what I've seen is that they ramp them pretty slowly. These aren't businesses that are going from algorithm to $100 million of exposure or $1 billion of exposure anytime soon. They're starting very, very small, and it's going to take a lot of time because they need money, right? I mean, they require the support of investors. So investors are thinking the same thing you're thinking. How do I know that this is giving me the right information? So I think there is some benefit to having just been through a very painful time when people are especially attentive. Yes?
I'm just curious why you think innovation lies more in the direction of data analytics rather than sort of data aggregation. As we see more devices beginning to include intelligence and creative ideas around aggregating demand and developing new data sources.
I don't know if I would exactly characterize my position that way, but I'll answer your.
Well, then off the slide that had the.
Yeah, so there's raw data on one side, data product on the other. So the stuff on the left, there's no question that there is value, there's real value in aggregation. no question about it. But I think if you look at the value chain, and if you look at a dollar and how much is going to go to the aggregator and how much is going to go to the person that's developed a robust product on that data, the latter is going to make a lot more money than the aggregator. That is my own experience in having seen the trends over the last 8 years, but also the fact that aggregation generally involves brute force. Now, very skilled brute force, but brute force. Whereas the stuff that deals with user experience, creativity, design, that's really, really hard. And making that match between product and people and having it resonate with people, I think, one thing we haven't talked about here is, what are some other skills that will augment what I've talked about here? Design is probably, and user experience is probably the biggest one. Lots of brilliant people, lots of smart algorithms, lots of great products in terms of what they do, but not necessarily that they're presented well. And in fact, it's almost a rule that the smartest people that develop the coolest high-tech products are the least sensitive to user experience. And in fact, there's just been a great example very recently where Josh James, that founded Omniture, started a company called Domo, just like a BI company. What he did is he started with the UX. He started with a beautiful front end and is now working backwards, which I think is a very interesting and legitimate take on solving a big data problem.
So it's interesting because I wanted to bring it back around to that. I guess my understanding is that it's difficult to find people that have these particular skill sets or create teams that can address these problems. So I guess I'm curious, your experience in trying to solve that problem. There's a theory of like the 10x programmer, and I already heard you say order of magnitude more. Is that something that you've found in practice? I think in the last 10 years, when I started out, there was a lot of talk about how we could, set up teams on different continents and using methodologies, create really great software. And I think we're starting to see people have really coming out of that room and looking for a better place to congregate. Is that your experience, or is there like an attempt to try and create a mass production environment where you can create the software, or do you really need people endowed with special ability and talent? And if that's the case, then how are you going about creating that? And that's something that if you could speak more about, I'd be really interested to hear about.
Sure. And I think what you said about kind of distributed software development is very, very interesting. We hate backing distributed teams in the early days because we feel the culture of a company and having everybody working together, the informal communications are as important as the formal communications. So I totally agree with that. I do think that there is a force multiplier of having a great scientist as part of a team that is working on solving a really hard problem. I do not think that, however, I don't think that it is, I think it can be taught, I guess is my point, that there are core skills that if you have them and if you are mentored, you can be a really, really, really great data scientist. I think much in the way that you can be a great developer, that there will still be those examples of the 10x, and those people they do exist in nature and can't really explain why, but they do. But in terms of just somebody who's really, really good that can serve in that function, they can be, in my experience, they can be made. And that's my goal, is to make more of them. Yes?
Do you find it interesting investment opportunities in healthcare information exchanges?
Can you be a little more specific? Healthcare information exchanges? What do you mean exactly?
I mean the aggregation of all that healthcare information coming out to state levels, a lot of federal funding to change behavior to the future, the consumption of medicine.
So
is big picture concept how that actually
general is a very exciting and dangerous and scary field. And that until there is, it's awful. I mean, if you talk about a vertical that's in desperate need of disruption, that's certainly one of them. Probably the biggest one. But I have seen precious little money go into exactly what you're talking about because of fears over things like privacy. Not that there aren't companies getting funded, it's just at such a teeny scale relative to what the magnitude of the problem is. And I think until the regulatory and privacy issues get more clearly addressed, it's still going to be viewed as danger zone for many VCs. Yes?
On that regulatory and privacy issue, can you be more specific as to what you would want states to do legislatively to basically take healthcare records of Facebook, where people would give up their privacy in order to get something which would be a higher quality of healthcare, or certainly speeding up the whole healthcare cycle? You don't have to go in for half an hour looking for the doctor to pull up records. You're handing the doctor your iPad and saying, "This is my records." Or self-diagnosing because the information is there. I mean, I can get on Facebook and very quickly link up with any number of people that I'm 1 degree or less separation of who are a psychologist, and literally have an email on the couch email session with them on Facebook in 30 minutes. And healthcare is really about information, and doctors these days are so behind the whole technology learning curve. If you get a doctor that's 30 or 40 years into the practice of general medicine, they're so far behind on the most recent information because they can't even handle the new technology. So what would you want us to be telling our legislators to do here in Michigan that would open it up so that you and the technology and the guys who will never have who are so smart they don't need the PhD to crunch data, will just take over it and do effectively what Facebook has done or what Google has done with information, only it's healthcare information.
I mean, I can't give you a step-by-step policy prescriptive. I love what you're saying. I agree with you. I mean, there have been attempts at the edges to do what you're talking about. I mean, there are a few startups that are doing, for instance, you mentioned psychology, that are doing psychology consulting online. Some of that stuff around the edges is happening, but what you're talking about gets to the heart of how misaligned the incentives are in the U.S. healthcare profession, right? Where prescribing expensive drugs is good and prevention is not necessarily good. Clearly, it would be great if we had a holistic perspective of medicine that was geared towards prevention, not acute care.
I'm actually looking at the principle of, and we have to have people in important positions start taking up the mantra that is, if I am paying for your health care, or if you are paying for my health care, why is that something that is private? Why is not my health record then in the public domain? Because the public is paying for it.
It's a very interesting rich area. I mean, we could talk about that for hours. I mean, honestly, healthcare is an area that we specifically have not spent gargantuan amounts of time on for this very issue. I mean, I love the things you're talking about. It's just we're powerless. Sadly. So I tech up so that's what I like to deal with. Back row.
One more question.
Alright. I've been my hand up the whole time, I don't know.
Sorry, dude, it was the beard.
No worries. So you mentioned the analogy between big data and the .com. And well, I guess at least in terms, right?
Yes.
The hype behind them. I wonder if you have any insight on how long you think this hype cycle is going to last for big data, and what nudges can you see between where are we in the big data kind of transformation of these companies or this this market, this industry? Are we a year in? Are we and if the .com thing lasted, I don't know, estimating 5
names, not in any way trying to link the two phenomena. Now, this to me, we're at the beginning of the game. I see this as being the stuff I talked about here as being an opportunity that is generational. I don't see it as being a 5 to 10 year phenomenon. That, yes, infrastructure stuff is going to.
I mean, you're still .coms, they're just not called .coms anymore, right?
Well, that's my point. Is that yes, the cost functions, the storage functions. I mean, it's asymptotic, right? Pretty much, we're going to be approaching processing the speed of light. That's all going to happen, and that's fine. But that's not where innovation is going to come from. Innovation is going to come from making all of our lives better, and that deals with things like the legislative environment, which is going to take a generation to fix. So I think that there are going to be opportunities, vertical by vertical by vertical, theme by theme by theme, that are going to be played out over many, 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 many years. So, yeah, I do not see this as being a fad. I see this as being a generational imperative that is going to affect us whether we like it or not.
All right. Thank you very much. That will close off the meeting, and for those of you who are interested in sponsoring A2NewTech, go to the organizers, or you can go to the website at a2newtech.org and contact the organizers that way.
Any announcements?
Any announcements?
Yeah, I got an announcement.
Start back there.
Speaking of big data, anybody who's looking for work and has experience in big data, I work for a very, very large company that has a local IT area. We're going to be posting about 4 or 5 positions. I posted my thing on the meetup site, so you can contact me.
Yeah, I'd like to make sure anybody wants to work with Finish Weekend. This weekend is a working pile. Sign up on finishweekend.com. Just bring your projects, kind of a hackathon, but with the purpose of getting something out the door in a weekend.
Okay. Sure. You can.
So we're having startup drinks tomorrow, 5:30 at Bar Louie. I hear Roger's going to be there. So come and join us. You can chat with other entrepreneurs.
Why not mention All Hands Active, your favorite local hackerspace? Thursday nights are always build nights. You're always welcome to come. That's all. Oh, Thursday nights at 525 East Liberty. It is next door to the Michigan Theater, and you can look it up at All Hands Active. Think about hands.
So A2NewTech Brewery every Friday. You guys hopefully know by now about the Beer 30, 4:30 p.m. every Friday. The fourth Friday every month we do a bigger one. This one will be a little bit special. Last NewTech I mentioned briefly. Our company is closing funding. I can announce it now. It's just actually Google will put $5 million into Duo. So we'll have a nice Beer 30. So come by the brewery Friday.
Any other announcements? Thank you very much.